Welcome back. This is part 4. At the end of the last podcast, I left you with this question. How does Article 69 of the CISG compare to Article 185 of the Swiss Code of Obligations? At which point does risk pass from the seller to the buyer according to the Swiss Code of Obligations? I assume that this is what you have found out. In the Swiss Code of Obligations, passing of risk is much earlier than in the CISG. According to the basic rule of Article 185, paragraph 1 of the Swiss Code of Obligations, it's already at the conclusion of the contract. As soon as the contract is concluded, risk passes from the seller to the buyer. This rule that is rooted in the Roman law principle of periculum est emptoris is much criticized, and it is indeed questionable whether it is appropriate under present-day conditions. But it is still the law, and it still applies. And the Swiss Federal Supreme Court decision indicated in the extra blackboard is a case in point. But what about our case? Should the parties better have excluded the application of the CISG in their contract? What do you think? What would you prefer, the CISG or the Swiss Code of Obligations? Well, of course, it depends on your perspective. If you are the foreign buyer, such as Y Limited in our case, you would probably prefer the CISG with regard to the passing of risk. But if you look at it through the eyes of a Swiss seller, such as XSA in our case, you would probably feel differently. From a seller's perspective, the rule of the Swiss Code of Obligations, Article 185, seems more advantageous. It means less risk for the seller and more risk for the buyer. Let me move on to a next issue, the issue of conformity or non-conformity of the goods sold. Disputes over the quality of the goods and over the claims the buyer can make if the goods are defective are the single most important areas of conflict in sales law practice. A number of provisions that are relevant in that respect are to be found in Part 3, Chapter 2, Section 2 of the CISG. Closely related provisions are contained in two other sections, namely Part 2, Chapter 2, Section 3 and Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 2. But for the moment, I would like to concentrate on Chapter 2, Section 2. This slide and the next, you have a short version of what this section offers. I invite you to scrutinize these few provisions, stopping the video at those two slides for a minute or two, and then to move on to the question that follows. On this slide, you have Article 35, and on the next slide, you have slightly shortened versions of the Articles 36, 38, and 39. And here is the question I would like to submit to you. Do these rules sound familiar to you, or do you find them rather unusual, having in mind what you know of Swiss sales law? Having gone through those few articles of the CISG, is there anything you are slightly shocked about, or do you feel rather comfortable with all of that?